Your job,
making America great again.
your money,
I'm excited about what we can continue to do.
your health care,
Now is the time for action.
your country.
Our world is a more dangerous place when America is not leading.
Decisions being made 1,000 miles away in Washington affect your everyday life. Tonight, you'll get the chance to make your voice heard with the people who represent you in our nation's capital.
From the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., this is a special production from your local election headquarters. Your Voice Arkansas, a congressional forum. Now to your host, Drew Petrimo.
Good evening and thanks for being with us. I'm Drew Petrimo. Tonight, we're looking at the big issues facing Arkansas and the country with all four of the state's U.S. representatives in Washington. This half hour, we're giving you the chance to let your voice be heard by your congressman. If you want to connect with us on social media, use the hashtag YourVoiceAR. We'll be tracking your tweets and Facebook posts throughout the next half hour. That will be the responsibility of our Jessie Tenora back in our studios in Little Rock. She'll be presenting your questions to your representatives this evening. Joining us, our 1st District Congressman Rick Crawford, representing Jonesboro, Batesville, and West Memphis. 2nd District Congressman French Hill, representing Little Rock, Conway, and Benton. 3rd District Congressman Steve Womack, representing Fayetteville, Bentonville, and Fort Smith. And 4th District Congressman Bruce Westerman, representing Hot Springs, Texarkana, and Pine Bluff. Gentlemen, welcome all of you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
7 months into the 115th Congress, I want to go around the room. Everybody take a minute. Grade yourselves. How do you think the body has performed so far? What accomplishments do you hang your hat on? And what are some of the failures, if you think there are any? Congressman Crawford?
Well, I think we're doing above average work. We have control of both chambers, control of the White House, and there was an awful lot to clean up from the previous administration. So if you think about what we've done from a regulatory standpoint, reining in bureaucratic regulations that have been harmful to a variety of industries. I represent a very heavily agricultural district. Things like WOTUS, Waters of the U.S., things like that mean an awful lot to folks back home that we can roll that back. And we've been able to accomplish things like that in this Congress.
Congressman Hill.
Well, it's good to be with you. I think in addition to a lot of the regulatory work that's been a major effort by the Trump administration with the Congress in the first few months, we've also got a new Supreme Court justice, which I think is a very important accomplishment of our Senate. I think it puts the court back on an even keel, a full membership. And I'd also like to say that we are beginning to do our work on the budget and spending priorities of the Trump administration, which we've undertaken. And finally, we've passed some very constructive legislation that I'm personally pleased with that help our veterans, that give accountability to the VA to make sure we deliver good service to our veterans. So we've got some good accomplishments in the first few months.
Womack.
Well, very, very pleased with what we've been able to accomplish in the House. The House has been very active, and for the last 7 months, we've, as has already been mentioned, churned out a lot of legislation, sent it over to the Senate. I'm an appropriator. We have marked up every one of our appropriation bills through the committee, so they've all been reported to the House. We'll take up 4 of those this week in a security package. As French said, we've got a Supreme Court justice, so if you're looking at it from in the totality standpoint, we've accomplished some things. Now, there are some things that are still not resolved. Health care, tax reform. These are very complicated, difficult issues that are going to take some time to kind of go through and make sure that we get this situation right. So from the House perspective, I give us a solid B. There are some things I wish we could have done a little better, but we'll come back and address those after we get back from the August recess. So overall, I'm pretty happy with where we are.
Congressman Westerman.
Yeah, and Drew, I think a lot of the achievements of this Congress have been talked about. If you look at the Congressional Review Acts, we've passed 15 of those out of the House. I believe 14 of them have been signed into law. Those are major regulatory reforms, something we can be proud of. We have passed the budget out of committee, but we have got a lot of work to do. There's not time to look back and at too many of our accomplishments because there's a lot on the horizon. Health care, tax reform, some more regulatory issues, regaining our Article I constitutional authority. we've got a lot of work left to do. So trying to look ahead and figure out the best path forward to do that.
Let's talk more about health care. All four of you voted for the American Health Care Act. It passed in May. This is the House plan to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, roundly criticized by leading healthcare organizations. We're going to put some of them on the screen here. They range from the American Medical and Hospital Associations to the Cancer Society to AARP. Congressman Hill, why not listen when all of those organizations are coming out against the legislation that you voted for?
Well, we've listened to a lot of different groups over the last 6 and 7 years on how to repair the problems that the Affordable Care Act has created. So we're listening to the American people. What about the 29 million people that are still not insured because they can't afford coverage under the Affordable Care Act? What about the people in group health plans that have seen over 100% average premium increase the last 4 years, 25% a year, with 50% planned in the coming year if we don't reform this law? What about the people who have lost their coverage? What about the people who can't afford their coverage? So this status quo
representing those people, though. I mean,
I think the AMA represents doctors, and doctors have a point of view. I think the AARP is primarily dealing with people who are covered by Medicare for the most part, people over 65, for example. So you named a couple of groups, but when you look at the people we hear from people who've lost their coverage, who can't afford their coverage, who are people spending between $20,000 and $30,000 a year for their premiums and their deductibles. And so what I think senators and House members are trying to do is, how do we bend the cost curve down? How do we be patient-centered? How do we give people more choice and give our states more choice on designing health care?
Congressman Womack, I wonder how you justify your vote when you look at what the Congressional Budget Office said about it. 23 million more people uninsured by 2026 relative to current law. States like Arkansas that expanded Medicaid stand to possibly lose the most. Did that not give you pause?
Well, you want to take into consideration what the experts say from a budget outlook, but that is that's kind of myopic in some respects. I think you got to look at it in a more holistic way. First of all, if you take away the individual mandate, there are a lot of people that are going to make the decision on their own not to have health insurance coverage for all the reasons that French just stated. But look, when I look at this thing from a holistic standpoint, I hear from a lot of my business community that have been hardshiped by the fact that that they are providing coverage right now that is that they're seeing their premiums go sky high, deductibles going even higher, to where it's really nothing but a catastrophic plan. So the fact is, we acted the way we acted because we know that Obamacare is failing. The Affordable Care Act is anything but that, and that something has to be done about it. And so we passed our bill in the House. We handed it to the Senate so that we can engage in a bicameral discussion about what to do about the complicated system of health care in this country. Nobody said that the Health Care Act that we passed in the House was the panacea, that it was going to be perfect in every respect. But we got the conversation started, and now it's underway in the Senate. And let's see what the two chambers can come up with when both are finished with their work.
I want to go to Jessie in our Little Rock studio. She has a question from a viewer also pertaining to health care. Jessie?
Hi, Drew, Congressman. This question comes from Manuel Garcia Jr., and he's saying, I'm a 63-year-old retiree paying for my own insurance. As of now, I'm paying $840 a month just for premiums. I figure that by the end of the year, I'll be putting out of pocket for co-pays, medications, and insurance about $18,000, and that's almost half of our retirement income. What is your plan to make sure people like me who are not on Medicare don't get thrown under the bus when you can't come up with a health care plan to protect all Americans?
Congressman Crawford, I want to pose that question to you and also add in there, President Trump called the plan mean.
Well, you know, look, through the course of this process, as French and Steve indicated, this is a starting point, and we have teed this up for the Senate. We're going to work with the Senate to try and address the concerns that this individual expressed, but it's a problem for everybody. You know, just personally, my wife works in a hospital, and she's a highly educated professional woman. And when we get medical bills after an episode of care, it's very difficult to discern how these bills are generated, how much is being paid, how much we're responsible for. So imagine if you're a senior and you're going through that. I mean, you're talking about a professional woman who works in the healthcare industry and she has difficulty. I think we need to be focusing on how it's not about the quality of care in this country at all. This is an insurance issue, and how we can deliver a more affordable product, number one, and a more discernible product that saves money. We can streamline and cut costs tremendously if we can address some simple things like that you really kind of speak to the heart of the confusion in this whole issue.
Congressman Westerman, I wanted to ask you about the tax cuts that are included in this piece of legislation. According to the Tax Policy Center, highest earning 20% of households, those making over $150,000 or more, would receive 80% of the benefits of the tax cuts. The top 1% would get half the benefits. I wonder why that's included in a health care plan.
Yeah, well, the tax cuts were aimed at the individual mandate and the employer mandate. And back to the issue on Mr. Garcia being 63 years old, close to being able to draw Medicare. One flaw that I saw with the House version of the budget or of the health care bill was the fact that the credits that were in there were not adequate for people near retirement age, but that's something the Senate fixed in their version of the bill, and it goes to the point that we got a bill out of the House, got it to the Senate. There were some changes being made. Now I don't know what the Senate's going to end up doing, but we're working constructively trying to come up with the best plan to fix our health insurance system because premiums are continuing to go up. We're hearing that premiums could go up 40–60% this fall, and it is imploding on itself. So we have got to continue working constructively to come up with a solution to address these issues.
Let me take one more one more question from Jesse back in Little Rock. It's about town hall meetings, and we'll come to you, Congressman Womack.
Yeah, so Regina Carter-Ald is asking about those town hall meetings, saying Arkansans have even traveled all the way to D.C. to talk to our representatives. We're trying to let our voices be heard, and they're not listening.
Do you think that the impact of people that came and kind of voiced their opinions about this had an impact on the debate?
Well, I hosted 4 back-to-back town hall meetings in April, and they all ranged anywhere from an hour and a half or longer. So we gave the public in the 3rd District of Arkansas a chance to come in and weigh in on matters not just related to health care, but although health care dominated the agenda at that time. And look, my staff goes out of its way to schedule every person that comes to Washington, D.C. that wants to sit down with us and talk about issues because we put a premium on the fact that if they're district personnel, if they're people from our district, then they're going to get the first invitation to be in the office to broach any subject with us that they care to do. But the point I wanted to make just a minute ago, remember what the House did is part of a process. House passes a bill, sends it to the Senate. Senate either takes up our bill or comes up with something different. We go to conference. We get something signed into law. Then the Department of Health and Human Services, through the Secretary of Health and Human Services, has certain things that he can do that are under his jurisdiction from a regulatory perspective to perfect things related to health care delivery. And then let's also remember that there is going to be a process later, legislatively, through regular order, that we can take up some of the other issues that complicate the health care accessibility of America. So it's not a House passes something and it's over and done with and take it or leave it. This is a process, and we need to let this process unfold.
Okay, I want to change subjects here a little bit. Talk about President Trump. I'm going to ask you for a show of hands here. Raise your hand if you think the president's Twitter habits are hurting his presidency. All four of you. Congressman Crawford, explain.
Well, look, what we need to be doing as members of the House, we're one body, the legislative body. We need to be on offense with regard to our activity in the House, the things that we're doing, the legislation that we're trying to put forward. What we don't need to be on is defense about things that are said in the public sphere on social media and taking our time to defend that. What we need to be is proactive and communicating with our constituents what's going on. And when we have to defend certain statements, that takes away from our ability to communicate what it is we're doing on a day-to-day basis.
Congressman Westerman, does his habits on Twitter, his propensity to speak out in that type of way, you're here to serve people back in Arkansas. Does it make that job more difficult when you're having to defend the way that Congressman Crawford is explaining?
Well, I try not to spend a lot of time defending the president's tweets. And I think when you look at his presidency, in one way it may be affecting his relationship with the media, but I think a lot of people obviously follow him and retweet those tweets, so it's a way for him to personally reach out to folks. I try to stay focused on the job that I'm doing, focused on the work of the House, and I'm glad to know that we've got a president that will sign bills into law when we pass them and get them through the Senate and on his desk.
I wanted so his president's approval rating in Arkansas is higher than it is nationwide, but polling has shown it's actually slipped some in recent months. Congressman Hill, what kind of a rating would you give the president on how the job that he's done so far?
Well, Drew, I think on the issue of foreign policy re-engagement around the world, in the Middle East, on the challenges that President Obama left us, I think he's doing well. I think he's got a great national security team. On domestic economic policy, he's put forward an aggressive, bold economic growth tax plan, which I hope the Congress will take up and work on. And as Rick noted earlier, he has proposed things that will right-size regulation and improve economic growth, including a major banking bill. He supported our Financial Choice Act in the House Financial Services Committee to correct financial regulation. So on foreign policy, domestic economic policy, I think he's moving in the right direction. On appointments, I think he's appointed some fine cabinet secretaries. I think he's appointed, as we said, Judge Gorsuch has done a good job at the Supreme Court. So this is why I've been frustrated by off-message tweeting as opposed to staying on message with his communications. I think it's distracted from the good work that he's leading.
Congressman Crawford, you're on the House Intelligence Committee. You guys have been looking into the issue of Russian election interference in 2016 presidential election. The president and his team have denied any collusion with Russian government, but we keep hearing about these previously undisclosed meetings, and there's been resignations and recusals. Some officials have had to correct the record as far as statements that had been previously said. Is none of that suspicious to you?
Well, look, here's the thing, and as you said, I sit on the Intelligence Committee, but I can comment on the things that are in the public sphere, and we've had a couple of public hearings, and some of the things that have been disclosed publicly. For example, former CIA Director Brennan, he indicated that Russian active measures in elections in the United States are nothing new. They've been going on for decades. So what we have here, and the evidence bears this out, is yes, there was contact. But does that rise to the level of any criminal activity? No, there's no evidence to suggest that there's any criminal activity. And then collusion, define collusion. Is it inappropriate for a transition team, members appointed by the president in the transition team and potential cabinet appointees, is it inappropriate for them to interact with foreign nationals? No, it happens all the time.
So in your eyes, this is run-of-the-mill. This is what campaigns and this is what people that are transitioning into office do.
Right, and while we're on the subject of Russia, and I think to be a comprehensive, fulsome investigation, we need to revisit the Clinton association with Russia, and because there was certainly collusion there and possibly some collusion with other nations that were involved in the election in some capacity, whether that was through fundraising or whether it was through some other active measures. But the Clintons are being left out of this, but there's a track record there, and I'm disappointed that we're not seeing more and hearing more from the media about the role that the Russians have played in the Clinton campaign. One
more Russia question, and we'll get on to some other issues, but I wanted to ask Representative Hill, there was a recent article in Politico that details a meeting between yourself and two Russians that are now at the center of some of this controversy involving the president's campaign activities. This happened in Moscow in the spring of 2016. How did you become involved in this? What exactly happened at this meeting? And are you concerned at all with the level of contact between administration officials and Russian actors?
Well, that meeting took place on a congressional visit to Moscow to meet with the Deputy Foreign Minister to talk about Syria and the Ukraine and have a perspective from Russia on what the Russian Federation's view was on those two issues, and we expressed our view on behalf of the American people and the Congress on what we thought solutions in Syria and the Ukraine might be. At that time, we did a roundtable on television, and at that roundtable on television at a think tank in Moscow, I was approached by the two people you referenced, and they talked about potentially if the American Congress would change the name of an act called the Magnitsky Act, that perhaps Russia would be interested in opening up adoptions of Russian children. And so I didn't really honestly think that much about it, except to turn that information over to our embassy officials in Moscow, as well as the staff of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. It turns out the two people that were at that coffee, at that roundtable, were the two people that also visited here in Washington some months later.
Want to move on a little bit here to some different topics. So obviously, healthcare, Russia taking up a lot of the oxygen here in Washington, but many other issues of concern. And I'm specifically interested in where, as healthcare seems to, at least for the time being bogged down in the Senate with debate continuing, where would you like to see the debate go next? There's been talk of tax cuts, tax reform, infrastructure high on the list. Congressman Womack, what would you like to see the next issue taken up be?
Well, all of the above, but let's go back to a previous question. When you ask about, giving a grade to the Congress, I said at the time there are still some things that need to be done that are very important. We have passed a budget out of committee. Bruce and I both sit on the Budget Committee, so we have passed with a unanimous vote on the Republican side our budget. We need to take up that budget and get that budget resolution passed. That budget resolution, through the law, provides a procedure called reconciliation that gives us the vehicle to move, without having to be subject to a filibuster in the Senate, a major tax reform proposal. And so tax reform continues to be one of the promises we've all talked about that the president made in his campaign for 2016 that is still not settled. Ways and Means has been working on tax reform. We expect that once we move the budget reconciliation process of 2018 off the floor of the House and give it to the Senate, that we'll have an opportunity to move a tax reform proposal. It's already been mentioned, infrastructure is really important to Arkansas. It's important in my district. It's important all across our state. Personally, I think that maybe that should have been the lead in the political agenda this year, because it does generate bipartisan support. Everybody likes infrastructure. I wish if we could roll back time that we could have begun with infrastructure and be able to get people back to work, improving the infrastructure of Arkansas roads and bridges, and make that impact on the economy. So those are among the issues that are still unfinished, with a lot more work to do on the healthcare front, as you.
Speaking of infrastructure, let's go back to our studio in Little Rock. We have a question on that topic.
Yeah, Congressman, this one comes from Scott Richardson, and he's asking, what's the solution to our long-term infrastructure funding issues, and how will that impact I-49?
Let's go to Congressman Westerman on this one. What are the prospects for a big infrastructure, $1 trillion type program that the president talked about in his campaign that would require likely bipartisan support?
And I think an infrastructure project will get bipartisan support, and I agree with Congressman Womack. I wish we had started with that. Maybe it would have set a different tone here in D.C. had we done that. But when you look at funding streams, that's the problem with an infrastructure project, is how do you pay for $1 trillion? And there's actually more infrastructure work in our country that needs to be done than $1 trillion. In the president's proposed budget, they had $200 billion that they proposed for infrastructure. And there's a myriad of ways to fund infrastructure. One thing that's been done in Australia is called recycling, where you actually take state and local infrastructure such as water treatment, sewer treatment, airports. Those are leased for 50 years, and you put the money into an infrastructure account. You've got offshore money that could be brought back in and raise funds that way. You hear a lot about private-public partnerships. When you look around the country, there's places where that works better than other places. I know the Mobile Bay, Interstate 10 is one of the busiest interstates in the country, and the tunnel going under Mobile Bay is the bottleneck on it. So the city of Mobile would like to put a toll bridge over the bay. You could pay for a toll bridge over Mobile Bay, but there's really not any place in Arkansas where tolls work. So it's going to be a multi-pronged approach, and I always tell people this: we're paying about $300 billion a year in interest payments on the debt, and the Highway Trust Fund was short $15 billion last year. So in the big picture, we've got to address our debt issue, our mandatory spending issues, and that's one thing that the budget does. We were looking at over $200 billion of mandatory spending savings in the budget. So let's work on the budget and generate revenue streams so that we can do things that everybody wants to do, and that's infrastructure.
Are you
projects.
concerned that as we move forward, if we go from tax reforms to tax cuts to infrastructure spending, that this is just spend, spend, spend? Like, when do you get to the actual cutting?
Well, that's the issue that Steve and I dealt with on the budget committee, is how do we get a budget that balances in 10 years, that addresses the concerns that we have. And when you look at our spending, the 12 appropriation bills that that Steve and the appropriation committee has been working on, that's $1 trillion. The spending last year was $4 trillion. 3/4 of what we spend is in mandatory spending on cruise control. We can't balance the budget on mandatory spending. We're going to have to address the tough issues, or we can't balance it on discretionary. We've got to address the tough issues with mandatory spending, and we're starting to look at that.
I want to ask Congressman Hill about the Financial Choice Act. This is a piece of legislation the House passed last month, repeals some of the provisions of the Dodd-Frank Act that was passed in the midst of the Great Recession. Democrats on the Hill have said it's a handout to Wall Street. It removes vital protections that were passed after the economy collapsed. Why is it not that?
Well, first of all, the Wall Street banks basically don't support the Financial Choice Act. What we've seen in the last 6 years is the big banks on Wall Street have gotten bigger and more profitable, and our community banks in towns all across Arkansas have gotten smaller and had more compliance costs. And this is because Washington and the Dodd-Frank Act took a one-size-fits-all approach and applied a standard that's appropriate for Wall Street institutions, but not so much for our local Main Street banks. So what the Financial Choice Act does is right-size regulation for our community banks, our credit unions, our small brokerage firms, maintains the strict oversight of the big Wall Street complex institutions, and in fact sets up the highest financial penalties for malfeasance by financial dealers in this bill. So I think this bill is pro-growth. I think it helps our community financial institutions, and it helps consumers by giving them more choice and lowering costs on products that are important to them, like credit cards and home mortgages.
Just have a little bit more time, but I wanted to go around the room and ask another question. The current debt limit right now, $19.8 trillion, that has to be raised later this year to allow the government to continue paying its bills. This was a big fight during the Obama presidency over whether this should be done each time. Congressman Crawford, do you think that would you vote for that without concrete spending cuts coupled with it?
Well, this kind of dovetails with what Bruce said earlier. The fact is, we got to get our arms around our national debt, and there's not really been any serious conversation about how you do that. And I think that this is why I and many of my colleagues support a balanced budget amendment or a spending limitation amendment, which would essentially prevent this type of thing over time. Spending limitation amendment, you could cap spending as a percentage of GDP. And obviously some provisions in there to allow those spending caps to be broken in a time of emergency. But my point is this, that yeah, we're going to probably have to wrestle with this debt ceiling again, but we're going to do this for the foreseeable future if we can't have this conversation about how we address our debt long term. And I think a balanced budget amendment or a spending limitation amendment, a fundamental underpinning that forces Congress to behave in a certain way, is the right way to go.
Running out of time, but Congressman Westerman, can you vote for it without attached spending cuts?
No, it's going to have not just spending cuts, but mandatory spending cuts. And we've got to fix this so that we're not having to come back and do it again. And the only way to do that is through mandatory spending cuts.
All right, we'll have to leave it at that. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. That does it for tonight, but our conversation continues Sunday on Capitol View. We will be discussing more of the issues affecting Arkansas. Check your local listing, and let's keep the conversation going on social media. Use the hashtag YourVoiceAR. Until Sunday, good night from Washington.